The private medical scanner hummed in the darkness of Lyra's quarters, its blue light casting geometric patterns across skin that should have glowed with health, but instead carried a sickly pallor beneath the surface. She watched the display with the detached precision of someone trained to read data without flinching at the implications. The molecular analysis scrolled past, and with each line, something cold settled deeper into her chest. Custom synthesized, genetic targeting, dosage calibrated for slow degradation. She'd felt wrong for 10 days before running the test 6 weeks ago. A wrongness that lived in her bones, in the way her bioluminescence dimmed at the edges, in how her right side had begun to favor itself as though protecting against damage she couldn't yet see. Rulers didn't complain about feeling tired. Rulers pushed through stress and inadequate sleep and the weight of negotiating peace between species that had spent the last decade trying to destroy each other. But this wasn't stress. The scanner identified the compound structure, and Lyra's breath stopped in her throat. She knew this poison. She'd designed it herself 7 years ago as a theoretical exercise in control and consequence, a compound that could destabilize Valderon genetic markers so precisely that death would appear natural. An academic paper she'd published under research protocols classified the moment it proved viable. Someone had read her work. Someone had access to her private quarters. Someone wanted her dead in a way that looked like she'd simply worked herself into an early grave. Lyra sat in the blue light of her scanner and did the mathematics. 6 weeks at current dosage progression. Perhaps 8 if she managed her stress perfectly, avoided physical exertion, kept her adrenaline response controlled. She thought about going to her cabinet, about demanding investigations, about locking down every person with security clearance to her quarters. Then she thought about how many of those people might be involved in wanting her dead. Instead, she began to document every symptom, every access log to her quarters, every member of her government whose political calculations might benefit from her quiet disappearance. The list grew longer than she wanted to admit. 17 individuals with means, motive, and opportunity. In the days that followed, Lyra moved through state functions with the careful control of someone performing surgery on themselves without anesthesia. She smiled at the right moments. She signed treaties her hands wanted to tremble through. She stood at observation decks and looked at the stars and calculated how many of them she'd see before the poison finished its work. And she watched. 3 weeks before the state dinner that would change everything, a new cultural liaison arrived on the flagship. Human, male, walking with a limp that suggested old injury rather than temporary damage. His file said his name was Nathaniel Thorne, that he'd served in the Marine Corps before an IED in Afghanistan had destroyed his left leg and ended his combat career, that he'd spent the last 5 years in diplomatic training after being medically discharged. What his file didn't say was visible in the way he moved through the flagship's corridors. Careful, observant, someone who'd learned to read rooms for threats and calculate exit strategies without appearing to do either. His dark hair was kept military short, his jaw carried stubble he never quite shaved clean, and his expression held the particular awareness of men who'd seen enough violence to recognize it before it arrived. Lyra watched him navigate his first week aboard, watched how he responded when Valderon officials tested him with minor protocol violations, seeing if the new human would correct them or let it pass. He corrected them gently, without aggression, making it clear he knew the rules without weaponizing that knowledge. Watched how he handled his pain. The limp was constant, but his face rarely showed discomfort. Only in small moments, when he thought no one was observing, did the tightness appear around his eyes. The subtle shift of weight that meant his leg was screaming at him, and he was translating that scream into information rather than limitation. She understood that translation. She'd been doing it herself for 5 weeks. During diplomatic briefings, she observed how he listened, not just to words, but to what lived beneath them. When officials spoke in careful euphemisms about political transitions and natural changes in leadership structure, his posture remained professionally neutral. But something shifted in the set of his shoulders, a recognition that he was hearing the shape of conspiracy without being told its details. The question Lyra found herself calculating was simple and impossible. If crisis came, if the conspiracy moved against her openly, if she needed someone outside the web of Valderon politics to trust, Could this human with the broken leg and careful eyes be that person? Or would he do what protocol demanded and step back, maintain proper distance, let Valderon internal affairs remain internal? She needed to know. Because the poison was progressing, and her timeline for gathering evidence was shortening, and soon she'd have to make decisions about whether to die quietly or fight publicly. If she fought, she'd need allies who chose principle over convenience. The state dinner arrived with all the elegant formality that preceded disaster. The observation deck stretched like a cathedral of stars, holographic projections overhead showing the space between human and Valderon territories, the neutral zone they were negotiating to expand. 200 guests moved through the chamber in formal regalia, human dignitaries in dark suits alongside Valderon officials whose ceremonial armor caught every light source and threw it back in blues and golds and silvers. Lyra wore the full weight of her station. Ornate blue and gold regalia that marked her as ruler, ceremonial armor that was both beautiful and functional, crown elements woven through her dark hair that weren't decoration, but biological markers of authority that had grown there since her coronation. The armor dug into her right side where the poison had begun to create stress fractures in her tissue structure, but she'd learned to move through pain without showing it. Mostly. She stood in conversation with 3 government officials, discussing trade route expansions with the kind of focused attention that kept her mind sharp despite the poison's attempt to create cognitive fog. Her eyes, the color of winter sky over frozen lakes, tracked the room even as she spoke, monitoring the complex social dynamics that could shift political alliances before dessert was served. That's when she saw him. Nathaniel Thorne stood near the far observation window, nursing a drink that probably tasted like copper and regret if human alcohol followed the same translation patterns through Valderon beverage synthesis. His formal jacket sat awkwardly on shoulders that seemed built for combat gear rather than diplomatic uniforms. He shifted his weight subtly, compensating for his leg, and even from across the chamber, Lyra recognized the particular quality of that movement. The pressure systems on the flagship were fluctuating. The variance was minor, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't live with chronic pain. But she noticed it in the way her right side ached differently, and she saw that he noticed it in the way his left leg was forcing him to redistribute his balance. His gaze found hers across the chamber. For exactly 3 seconds, they held eye contact. Protocol said 3 seconds was the maximum before it became inappropriate familiarity. On the 4th second, Lyra made a decision. She excused herself from the government officials with fluid grace and moved toward him. The crowd parted without conscious thought, the way crowds always did around rulers, creating a path that was both respect and distance. Her steps were impossibly elegant, despite the ceremonial armor's weight, despite the pain in her right side, despite knowing that every movement was being observed and analyzed by people trying to determine if she was weakening. She stopped precisely 2 meters from Nathaniel Thorne. Protocol demanded 2 meters. She'd spent 30 years learning to measure distance with her body. Your leg. She offered no preamble, no diplomatic softening. His eyes widened slightly at the directness, then something like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. Your attention to minute discomfort is unsettling to human sensibilities. I find human sensibilities remarkably difficult to read. Lyra let her gaze trace his face with the intensity she normally kept hidden behind diplomatic masks. Yet I seem to read you quite clearly. It's inconvenient. The amusement at his mouth deepened into something that might become a smile. Around them, conversations had quieted. People were watching. Protocol demanded formality. Protocol demanded distance. Protocol demanded that a Valderon ruler maintain proper separation from a human cultural liaison. Lyra had spent 5 weeks gathering evidence on people who'd violated far more important protocols than physical proximity. Dance with me. The words created a small shockwave through the observation deck. Conversation stopped entirely now. She watched Nathaniel's expression shift through several calculations, saw him recognize exactly what she was asking and what it would cost. Protocol forbade touch without formal consent ceremonies. Rulers didn't dance at state dinners. Liaisons definitely didn't lead their diplomatic contacts through intimate physical connection. He extended his hand anyway. The contact was shocking. His skin was rougher than Valderon physiology, calloused from years of handling weapons and tactical equipment, warm in a different way than her people's warmth. a heat that didn't carry bioluminescence but felt solid and real against her palm. Her fingers curved around his, and the simple act of that connection sent information cascading through her nervous system. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, from the effort of standing for 2 hours on a leg that was screaming at him to sit down. "You have no concept of appropriate boundaries," she said, allowing him to draw her toward the open floor where a few brave couples were already moving to the harmonic music that filled the space. "Perhaps not." His voice carried a roughness that suggested he'd spent time shouting orders over gunfire. "But you're not refusing." They moved into dance position. His hand found the small of her back through her regalia. Hers rested on his shoulder, feeling the tension in muscles that had been trained for combat and retrained for diplomacy. The configuration technically violated 3 separate protocols, and Lyra could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes cataloging each violation. She didn't care. Nathaniel moved well for someone with a destroyed leg. Not gracefully, not like Valderon officials who trained in formal dance since childhood, but with a controlled competence that turned limitation into different kind of strength. He led but didn't force, following the rhythm while allowing her space to adjust. "You're testing me," he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear. Lyra felt something shift in her chest. He was smarter than his file suggested. "Yes. What am I being tested for?" "Whether you'll choose what's right over what's comfortable when I give you permission to break the rules." They turned, and she watched his eyes track her face, saw the exact moment he noticed the tightness around her eyes, the way she caught her breath when he drew her closer, the subtle stiffness along her right side that she'd been hiding for weeks. "You're in pain." Not a question. An observation delivered with the flat certainty of someone who recognized the landscape of chronic suffering because he lived there himself. Lyra's response came without thought, without the careful diplomatic editing she normally applied to every word. "I'm always in pain." The resignation in those words surprised her. She hadn't meant to reveal that much truth. Around them, the music continued, the harmonic frequencies designed to soothe Valderon neural patterns while remaining pleasant to human hearing. The holographic stars overhead flickered in their programmed rotations, creating the illusion of movement through space. Nathaniel's grip on her waist tightened slightly, not possessive, protective. "How long? Does it matter?" "Yes." Such a simple answer, such absolute certainty. Lyra looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected to find. Someone who would care about her pain, not because she was a ruler or a political entity or a diplomatic necessity, but because she was a person suffering and he had the capacity to recognize that suffering in others. She'd been testing him to see if he'd choose principle over protocol. He'd already chosen her. The alarms began to sound before she could process what that meant. The sound started low, a frequency that Valderon hearing caught before human ears registered it. Lyra felt it in her bones first. A vibration that said something fundamental about the flagship's structure had changed. Then the human frequency alarms joined, and the observation deck's elegant atmosphere shattered into chaos. The explosion detonated in the central atrium 3 levels below them. Lyra felt it through the deck plating, through the sudden shift in artificial gravity as the flagship's stabilization system struggled to compensate. The holographic stars overhead flickered and collapsed into false darkness. Emergency lighting activated with a sickly amber glow that made the destruction look like something from a fever dream. "Secure the deck!" Her voice cut through the panic with absolute authority, the tone she'd been trained from childhood to produce under any circumstance. "Direct evacuation to..." The second explosion hit closer. The observation deck became a rain of glass and metal and architectural elements that weren't supposed to move. Lyra saw officials scatter, saw security forces moving toward exits that were already beginning to fail. The blast had come from below, and the ship's central column was compromised. They all felt it in the same moment, the disaster cascading upward through the flagship's infrastructure. Nathaniel's hand was still on her waist. His grip had shifted from protective to purely tactical, his body angling to put himself between her and the nearest falling debris. Combat instincts overriding diplomatic training. Lyra pulled herself from his grip with the authority of absolute command and moved toward the primary emergency exit. She had responsibilities. 200 people on this deck, and protocol demanded she ensure their evacuation before considering her own safety. She made it 3 steps before the floor beneath her simply ceased to exist. No warning, no time to adjust her weight or calculate an alternative path. The deck plating fractured with a sound like the flagship itself was screaming, and gravity took her down into the darkness between levels, between moments, between the world that had been and the one tearing itself apart. Lyra's training activated in the seconds of freefall. Protect your head, keep your limbs loose to absorb impact. Try to control your descent angle. But training couldn't account for the chaos of a collapsing ship, couldn't predict the trajectory of debris that fell with her or the sharp edges of what used to be elegant corridors. She hit hard. The impact drove breath from her lungs and sent pain cascading through her right side where the poison had already weakened tissue structure. Something in her armor cracked, or maybe something in her ribs beneath the armor. The darkness was complete except for the strobing emergency lights, and the air tasted like burning metal and the sweet copper smell of Alderon blood. Her own blood, she realized, running hot down her temple where her head had connected with something unforgiving. Lyra lay in the rubble and did rapid damage assessment, legs responsive, arms functional, spine intact, right side screaming but still operational. Head wound bleeding but not arterial. She was alive, which meant she needed to move before the continuing structural failure made that status temporary. She tried to push herself up and discovered the problem. A beam, support structure that had torn free from the ceiling during the collapse, landing across her left side at an angle that pinned her against the floor. She could feel the weight of it, easily 3 times her body mass, pressing down with enough force that attempting to shift it through pure strength would accomplish nothing except accelerating her oxygen debt. The poison was already making her weaker than she should be. Physical exertion would accelerate its progression. Every action she took now was trading future survival time for present necessity. Lyra analyzed the beam's position with her engineering background. Leverage point here, secondary support there. If someone could apply force at the correct angle while she pushed from below, the physics would work. The beam would shift just far enough for her to extract herself. But she was alone in the darkness, and the flagship was still failing around her, and the poison in her system was already beginning to spike her adrenaline response, which would accelerate the degradation timeline. She was going to die here, not in 8 weeks, not even in 72 hours if she could manage stress and exertion. Here, now, trapped beneath debris, while the conspiracy that had poisoned her succeeded through simple structural collapse rather than genetic assassination. Footsteps, uneven, heavy, moving through the rubble with systematic purpose. Lyra turned her head, sending fresh waves of pain through her skull, and saw a silhouette descending through the fractured deck above. Emergency lighting caught the figure in amber strobes, and she recognized the limp, the broad shoulders, the military short hair. Nathaniel Thorne was climbing down into the destruction after her. "Get away!" Her voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by dust and blood. "Protocol forbids contact. You'll contaminate the investigation when they find my body." He dropped the last 2 meters, landing in a controlled fall that had to have sent agony through his damaged leg. When he straightened, his face was set in an expression she hadn't seen during his 3 weeks of careful diplomatic observation. This was the Marine who'd survived Afghanistan, who'd learned to move through environments where hesitation meant death. "I've got you." 3 words, simple and absolute. A promise delivered with such certainty that it cut through protocol and politics and every reason she had to send him away. Nathaniel moved to the beam without wasting time on arguments she could see gathering behind her eyes. His hands assessed the weight, the angle, the way it had pinned her against the debris field. She watched him calculate the same physics she'd already analyzed, saw his gaze track the leverage points and secondary supports. "I can't move this alone." His voice held no defeat, just tactical assessment. "But if I brace here and use this secondary beam as fulcrum, the angle shifts enough that you might be able to pull yourself free." Lyra felt something unexpected move through her chest. He'd looked at the same problem she had and reached the same engineering conclusion. The secondary support beam won't hold more than 400 kilograms of transferred force. The primary beam mass is at least 500. Then I'll need to create mechanical advantage through positioning. He was already moving, testing the secondary beam's stability. "When I push, you pull. Timing has to be exact." Nathaniel, she used his name for the first time, let it carry the weight of what she needed to say. This will violate every treaty governing human Valderon physical contact. They'll execute you for touching me. He positioned himself against the secondary beam, his body angling to create maximum leverage. Then they'll execute me. The first attempt failed. The beam didn't shift. Nathaniel's jaw tightened with effort, his damaged leg threatening to buckle under the transferred force. Lyra pushed from below with everything she had, but the physics didn't work. The angle was wrong by fractions of a degree that might as well have been kilometers. "You can't," Lyra said, and it sounded almost like relief. Permission, perhaps, to accept the inevitable. She'd been calculating her own death for 5 weeks. This just accelerated the timeline. Nathaniel repositioned. She watched him adjust his stance, redistribute his weight, find some minor modification in angle that her engineering mind recognized as theoretically sound, but practically impossible given the strength required. He pushed. The beam moved. Not much, just enough. Metal grinding against metal, the sound of physics being forced to cooperate through pure, stubborn application of force. Nathaniel's face showed the cost of that force. The way his body was translating years of pain tolerance into this single moment of maximum effort. "Now," he managed through gritted teeth. Lyra pulled. Her armor scraped against debris. Her right side screamed in protest. And the poison in her system spiked her adrenaline response to levels that would cost her hours off her survival timeline. She didn't care. She pulled with everything she had, and her body slid free just as the beam rolled back into its original position with a crash that said they wouldn't get a second attempt. She was free. Nathaniel's arms found her before her legs could fully support her weight. He locked his grip around her waist, taking her mass against his body with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd carried wounded soldiers before. The contact sent electricity through her nervous system, warm skin against armor, his breath harsh against her ear, the smell of human sweat and Valderon blood mixing in the close darkness. "Can you walk?" His voice rumbled through his chest where her head rested. Yes, probably, if she ignored the way her right side was threatening to collapse and the poison was beginning to affect her coordination. "Then we move. This section won't hold." They made it 15 meters before another part of the deck collapsed somewhere nearby. The sound was a drawn-out shriek of metal failing, and Nathaniel adjusted their path without breaking stride, his tactical awareness routing them toward the emergency corridor that might still be intact. Lyra's dark hair fell across his neck, her ceremonial crown elements catching on his collar. Her breath was shallow against his ear, each inhale a negotiation with pain and poison and the adrenaline spike that was accelerating the timeline of her death. "You've violated every treaty," she whispered. "Good." They reached a secure chamber, one of the protected server rooms that maintained redundant systems even when the rest of the ship failed. The door was damaged but functional. Nathaniel keyed it with one hand while supporting her weight with the other, a coordination that shouldn't have been possible and absolutely was. Inside, the lights were stable. The doors sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss that suggested safety was temporary at best. Nathaniel lowered her to the bench along the wall with careful precision, his hands gentle despite the urgency still thrumming through his frame. Lyra looked up at him. His face was streaked with dust and blood, some of it his, some hers. His expression held an intensity that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with choice. He'd descended into destruction to find her. He'd violated protocol to free her. He'd carried her to safety knowing it would cost him everything. She'd tested him to see if he'd choose principle over convenience. He'd chosen her. "There's something you need to know," Lyra said, watching his face. "The poison, the conspiracy, all of it." Nathaniel knelt beside the bench, his damaged leg protesting the position, but his focus entirely on her. "Tell me." So she did. All of it. The medical scanner's readout 6 weeks ago. The custom synthesis based on her own research. The 5 weeks of gathering evidence. The 17 suspects. The timeline that had given her 8 weeks to live if she stayed calm, but was now compressed because the rescue's adrenaline spike had accelerated everything. "I was building a case," she said, "evidence that could stand in court. I needed proof before I could move publicly." She watched his face process each piece of information without flinching. "I wasn't planning to die quietly, but I wasn't planning for this either." "The explosion," Nathaniel said. "They moved early." "Yes, Lyra felt exhaustion pulling at her, the poison and injury and stress combining into a weight that wanted to drag her under. Someone knew I was close to having enough evidence. They attacked before I could act. Who? I don't know, not certainly, but I have suspects, and if I die here, they win. She met his gaze. I can access the genetic archives. The cure exists. But reaching it broadcasts my location and vulnerability across every political faction in both our governments. It tells the conspirators I'm aware and fighting. They'll move to contain me before I can expose them. How long do we have? To access the archives? 12 hours before they execute me for surviving when I should have died. To synthesize the cure? She felt the number like a weight. 72 hours before the poison becomes irreversible. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. She could almost see the calculations moving behind his eyes, the same kind of tactical assessment he'd done with the beam, looking for leverage points, finding angles that might work. Then we fight, he said finally. We find the cure, we expose the conspiracy, and we make sure they regret ever thinking you were someone that they could quietly eliminate. Lyra felt something dangerous move through her chest. Hope, maybe. Or recognition that she'd found exactly what she'd been testing for. An ally who chose truth over convenience. A partner who would stand with her against impossible odds because standing was the right thing to do. They'll execute you for this, she said. For touching me, for helping me, for knowing state secrets. I know, Baiso. But his hand found hers where it rested on the bench. The contact was warm and solid and absolutely forbidden. Light pulsed beneath her skin where their flesh connected, her body's bioluminescence responding to the emotional intensity of the moment. Because 3 weeks ago, I watched you navigate a diplomatic crisis that should have started a war, and you found a solution nobody else had considered. Because I've seen you stand for 2 hours in ceremonial armor that I know is hurting you, and you never let that pain show. Because when you asked me to dance, you were testing if I had the courage to choose what's right over what's safe. His grip tightened slightly. And because when you fell, the only thing I could think was that I needed to make sure you survived. Not because you're a ruler, because you're you. Lyra looked at their joined hands, her green-hued flesh against his human skin, the visible proof of every protocol they were violating. In Valderon physiology, bioluminescence responded to emotional intensity. She was glowing bright enough to cast shadows. I need your help, she said quietly. I can't do this alone. You're not alone. Nathaniel's voice carried absolute certainty. We'll find a way. We'll expose them. We'll make sure you survive. He paused. What do you need me to do? Before Lyra could answer, the chamber's proximity alert activated. Someone was approaching. Multiple someones, moving with purpose through the damaged corridors. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss that suggested violence. Torvin entered with 3 security officers, weapons drawn with the casual proficiency of people who'd trained to use them on much worse than a human and a damaged ruler. His tall frame filled the doorway, pale silver eyes tracking the scene with calculation that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with conspiracy. Lyra felt Nathaniel move immediately, positioning himself between her and the weapons. Even injured, even knowing he was outmatched, his instinct was protection. Stand down, Torvin. Lyra's voice carried absolute authority despite her compromised state. Years of training to command even when authority was all she had left. Torvin lowered his weapon slightly, but didn't holster it. The human is under arrest for protocol violation. Remove yourself from the ruler's presence, and you may live long enough to be executed in a formal proceeding. Nathaniel didn't move, didn't step aside, didn't give ground. No, Lyra said the word simply, let it create a fracture in the room's atmosphere. Torvin's silver eyes shifted, a subtle movement that a human might have missed. Lyra didn't miss it. She saw the calculation in that shift, the moment where he recognized that she was compromised, and the recognition became almost luminescent satisfaction. She knew. In that instant, she knew. The poison, she said quietly. You know about the poison. Torvin's weapon came up in a smooth motion, pointing directly at Nathaniel's chest. The human is perceptive. Unfortunately, not perceptive enough. Torvin's weapon held steady, pointing at Nathaniel's chest with the kind of professional calm that came from decades of deciding who lived and who died. The 3 security officers flanked him, their own weapons tracking between the human who shouldn't be here and the ruler who should already be dead. Yes, Torvin said, and his voice carried an undertone of something that might have been respect if it wasn't wrapped in calculation. I know about the poison. I administered it. Lyra felt the confirmation settle into her bones like ice. 5 weeks of suspicion crystallizing into certainty. She'd narrowed the suspects to 17, and Torvin had been on that list, but having proof was different from having suspicion. The attack on the state dinner was designed to coincide with your physical stress response, Torvin continued, his weapon never wavering. Accelerates the progression. Provides a convenient narrative of negligence or sabotage, depending on how the political winds blow when they find your body. He gestured slightly with his free hand, the movement almost casual. Your government is already fracturing. The conspiracy I'm part of includes half your cabinet and most of your military command. When you die, which you will, in approximately 72 hours unless you access the genetic archives, which you won't because that would expose everything, your death will open the path for a regime far more aligned with human business interests. Nathaniel's body tensed beside her, ready to move despite the weapon pointed at his center mass. Lyra touched his arm lightly, a signal to wait. She needed information before violence. You understand what you're confessing? She said, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through her right side. I've been documenting everything for 5 weeks, Torvin. Every access log, every molecular change in the poison's progression, every communication between conspirators. She watched his expression shift, saw the moment her words registered. I've known about the poison since the third dosage adjustment, Lyra continued, her voice gaining strength. The one where you increased the concentration by 0.03% because you were getting impatient with the timeline. I have video logs of you entering my quarters at 0300 on 17 separate occasions. I have biochemical analysis proving the compound is based on my own research. I have communication intercepts between you and 6 cabinet members discussing when to accelerate my death. Torvin's weapon didn't waver, but something shifted in his posture. Evidence doesn't matter if you're dead in 72 hours, and you will be. The rescue accelerated everything. Every moment of physical exertion, every adrenaline spike. You've compressed weeks into hours. 72 hours is plenty of time to upload everything to secure archives, Lyra said. Plenty of time to broadcast it across every government frequency. Plenty of time to make sure that when I die, everyone knows exactly who killed me and why. You won't get the chance. The words were still forming when Lyra fired. The weapon had been concealed in the damaged sections of her regalia, a frequency-based pulse she'd designed herself for exactly this kind of scenario. It caught Torvin's right hand at the wrist joint, and the energy cauterized as it severed, stopping blood flow even as it separated flesh from bone. His weapon clattered to the floor, followed a half-second later by the hand that had held it. Torvin's scream was raw and immediate, years of tactical control shattered by sudden agony. Get him! The order came harsh through his pain, directed at the 3 security officers who were already moving. Nathaniel met them. He fought with brutal precision born from years in combat zones, his body remembering patterns drilled through repetition until they became instinct. The first officer came in fast, energy weapon charging, and Nathaniel was inside his guard before the shot could fire. An elbow to the temple, sweep the legs, use the falling body's momentum to throw him into the second officer. Both went down in a tangle of limbs and armor. The third officer was smarter. He'd seen what Nathaniel could do and adjusted his approach, circling to get an angle that wouldn't risk hitting his companions. His weapon tracked the human's movement with professional precision. Lyra shot him from the bench, not a killing shot. She'd aimed for his weapon arm, the same joint targeting technique she'd used on Torvin. The officer's weapon fell, his arm went dead, and Nathaniel was on him before he could process what had happened. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. Nathaniel's Marine Corps training activated fully now, no longer constrained by diplomatic protocols or the need to appear non-threatening. These men had been part of poisoning Lyra, had stood by while conspiracy worked to kill her quietly, had just threatened to finish the job. He made them pay for it. When it was over, 3 Valderon security officers lay on the floor, disarmed and disabled, but alive. Nathaniel stood over them, breathing hard, his damaged leg trembling from the exertion, but still holding his weight. Torvin had retreated to the far wall, his remaining hand pressed against the cauterized stump, his face twisted with pain and fury. You understand what you've just done? Both of you? You've confirmed every conspiracy allegation, made it look like the human controls you, orchestrates your decisions. Your government will move against you before nightfall. Lyra pushed herself off the bench with careful control. Her right side screamed in protest. The poison was accelerating through her system, feeding on the adrenaline spike from combat. She could feel it in the way her bioluminescence was beginning to dim at the edges, the way her thoughts had to push through increasing cognitive fog. The 72 hours Torvin had mentioned was optimistic, more like 60 now, maybe 48 if the acceleration continued. My government, she said, moving toward Torvin with the deliberate precision of a predator, has been complicit in attempting to assassinate me. Your conspiracy isn't isolated to a few officials, is it, Torvin? It runs deeper, much deeper. She knelt beside him, her hand finding his personal communication device attached to his armor's tactical webbing. His remaining hand tried to stop her, but Nathaniel was there, his grip on Torvin's wrist absolute. Lyra accessed the device with his biometric signature, the one he couldn't change while his severed hand was still cooling on the floor. Encrypted files opened under her touch. Communication logs, financial transactions, video conferences with officials she'd trusted for years, and humans. High-ranking human government officials discussing timeline adjustments and regime changes and the benefits of a Valderon ruler who would be more amenable to human business interests. The conspiracy wasn't Valderon, wasn't human, it was both, working together to eliminate her and install someone they could control. You were never going to survive this, Torvin said, watching her face as she processed the scope of what she was seeing. Even with evidence, even with proof, they'll execute you for protocol violations before you can present anything in court. The human's touch alone is worth a death sentence. They'll use that to silence you, claim you were compromised, mentally unstable from the poisoning. Lyra looked up at Nathaniel. His gaze met hers and she saw no fear there, no regret. Just a steady certainty that said he'd made his choice and wouldn't unmake it regardless of cost. Then we changed the game, she said quietly. She stood, swaying slightly as the poison and injury and exhaustion combined into a weight that wanted to pull her down. Nathaniel's hand found her elbow, steadying her without taking control, supporting without overshadowing. Secure him, Lyra said, gesturing to Torvin, and the others. We'll need them alive as evidence. While Nathaniel bound the security officers with their own restraints, using techniques that ensured they wouldn't escape without cutting off their own circulation, Lyra moved to the chamber's communication panel. Her fingers flew across the interface, bypassing security protocols she'd helped design, routing through channels that couldn't be easily traced or shut down. What are you doing? Nathaniel asked, finishing with the last officer and moving to her side. Calling in a favor. Lyra's hands didn't slow as she worked. From someone I trust. Someone who's been waiting 3 years for me to acknowledge I need help. The communication connected, encrypted through 5 separate relays. A human face appeared on the screen, female, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a professional knot. Lyra. Dr. Evelyn Cartwright's expression shifted through surprise to concern in the space of a heartbeat. You look like hell. I've been poisoned, survived an explosion, and I'm currently standing in a secure chamber with a human who just helped me fight off my own security forces. Lyra's voice held a thread of dark humor. Hell is probably an accurate assessment. Evelyn's eyes tracked to Nathaniel, assessed him in a glance, then returned to Lyra. The poison. You said you'd never synthesize it, that it was purely theoretical. Someone synthesized it for me, using my own research, custom-tailored to my genetic markers. Lyra pulled up the molecular analysis on a secondary screen. I'm sending you specifications now. Everything I've documented over 5 weeks of monitoring the progression. She watched Evelyn's face as the data transferred, saw the exact moment her former research partner recognized the elegance and the horror of what they were looking at. This is your work, Evelyn said quietly, the theoretical compound from the genetic instability paper. Someone actually built it. Yes, and I need you to build the cure. Lyra, the cure was theoretical too. We never tested the synthesis protocols. never verified the human biochemical components would integrate with Valderon genetic stabilizers. Evelyn's hands were already moving across her own console, pulling up research files that were 7 years old. This could kill you faster than the poison. Then I'll die trying instead of waiting. Lyra felt Nathaniel's presence beside her, solid and steady. I need this, Evelyn. Not just for me. For what comes after, the conspiracy runs deeper than I thought. Both our governments are involved. If I die quietly, they win. If I fight and fail, at least the truth dies with me loudly enough that someone might investigate. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her gaze tracking between Lyra and the data streaming across her screens. The synthesis requires equipment I don't have immediate access to: genetic sequencers, Valderon cellular stabilizers, a clean room environment rated for cross-species biochemical work. How long to gather what you need? 12 hours if I'm careful, 6 if I'm fast and don't care about getting caught. Lyra felt the timeline compressing again. 60 hours to irreversible damage, maybe less. 6 hours to gather equipment. That left 54 hours for synthesis, testing, and administration. Tight, incredibly tight, but possible. Be fast, Lyra said. I'm sending you a list of what's available on this flagship. The explosion compromised some systems, but the primary research labs should still be intact. What about you? Where will you be? Lyra glanced at Torvin, still bleeding against the wall, at the security officers bound and disabled, at Nathaniel standing beside her, his body language suggesting he was calculating defensive positions for every entrance. Making sure the conspiracy can't silence me before you finish. She paused. Evelyn, the cure synthesis, there's something you need to know about what it will require. I'm looking at the protocols now. Evelyn's expression grew serious. Lyra, to make this work, I can't just remove the poison. The compound has attacked your genetic expression mechanisms. To stabilize you, to save your life, I'll need to fundamentally rewrite the markers it targeted. Rewrite them how? You'll still be Valderon, but your genetic structure will carry human biochemical signatures permanently. Not obvious to visual inspection, but any genetic scan will show you've been altered by human intervention at the cellular level. Evelyn's eyes held hers through the screen. You asked me once why I left Valderon space to work with humans. This is why. Because I believed integration wasn't just political, it was biological. And if you let me synthesize this cure, you'll become proof of that. Lyra felt the weight of what Evelyn was saying. The cure wouldn't just save her life. It would mark her forever as someone who'd chosen human intervention over Valderon purity. Every medical scan for the rest of her life would show the integration. She looked at Nathaniel, at this human who'd violated every protocol to save her, who was willing to die for choosing her over convenience. Then mark me, Lyra said, extending her arm toward the screen as though Evelyn could administer the cure through the communication link. I choose integration. I choose him. I choose proving our species can merge at the most fundamental level. Make it work, Evelyn. I'll have the cure ready in 16 hours, Evelyn said. Maybe sooner if the equipment cooperates. Stay alive until then, Lyra. Don't let them win by dying before I can save you. The communication closed. Lyra stood in the blue glow of the console and felt exhaustion pulling at her with enough force that remaining upright required active effort. The poison was progressing faster now. She could feel it in the way her luminescence was dimming, in the subtle tremor that had started in her hands, in the cognitive fog that made thinking feel like pushing through deep water. Nathaniel's hand found hers. What do you need me to do? Such a simple question, such absolute willingness to help with whatever came next. Lyra turned to face him fully. The equipment Evelyn needs. It's distributed across 7 different medical bays on this flagship. Some of those bays are in sections that were damaged by the explosion. Some are in areas that will be locked down by security forces loyal to the conspiracy. You need me to get the equipment. Yes, she stopped. Swayed. Nathaniel's other hand came up to steady her, his grip firm but gentle. While I make sure the conspiracy can't cover this up, you're going to broadcast it. Not a question. He'd already calculated what she was planning. Yes, everything, the poison, the evidence, Torvin's involvement, the human officials, all of it public before they can execute me for protocol violations. Lyra met his gaze. It's the only move that keeps me alive long enough for the cure to matter. If I die now, they spin the narrative. If I go public first, my death becomes proof of conspiracy rather than convenient accident. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing the implications, the risks, the way this would expose both of them to immediate retaliation from governments that wanted them quiet. You're sure? No, Lyra felt her lips curve into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm terrified, but I'm also certain this is the only path that doesn't end with them winning. Then we do it. His hands tightened on hers. I'll get the equipment. You make them pay for thinking you were someone they could quietly eliminate. They had 6 hours before Evelyn's equipment gathering window closed. 6 hours to move across a damaged flagship while avoiding security forces who would kill them on sight. 6 hours for Lyra to prepare a broadcast that would either save her life or ensure her death accomplished something meaningful. Nathaniel moved first, checking the security officer's restraints one more time before gathering their weapons. He offered one to Lyra, but she shook her head. I still have mine, and I'm a better shot than you realize. I noticed. There was approval in his voice, maybe even pride. The wrist shot on Torvin was surgical. I designed the frequency weapon myself, tested it on Valderon physiology extensively. She watched him check the charge on the officer's weapons with professional efficiency. I know exactly where to aim for maximum damage with minimum lethality. Remind me not to make you angry. Despite everything, the poison, the pain, the conspiracy, the countdown to irreversible death, Lyra felt something warm move through her chest. I'll do my best. They divided the equipment list. Nathaniel would hit the medical bays in the damaged sections where his tactical skills would be most valuable. Lyra would access the secure research labs where her biometric clearance still functioned. They'd meet back in the secure chamber in 4 hours, giving them 2 hours to route everything to Evelyn's location. Before Nathaniel left, Lyra caught his arm. If this goes wrong, if I don't... She stopped, started again. Thank you for descending into destruction after me, for choosing to help when walking away would have been safer. Nathaniel turned back to her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. I told you before, when you fell, the only thing I could think was that I needed to make sure you survived. Not because you're a ruler. He lifted his hand, cupped her face with a gentleness that contradicted the violence she'd just seen him commit. Because you're you. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, following the soft glow that bloomed beneath her skin at his touch. And I'm going to make damn sure you survive this. Then he was gone, moving through the damaged corridors with the tactical awareness of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile territory. Lyra stood alone in the secure chamber with 3 bound security officers and Torvin bleeding against the wall. She looked at the man who'd served her family for 20 years, who'd stood beside her through 3 assassination attempts from external threats, who'd poisoned her with her own research because someone offered him enough to make betrayal worthwhile. You made a mistake, she said quietly, moving to stand over him. You assumed I'd die quietly, that I wouldn't fight, that I'd accept inevitability with grace. Torvin's silver eyes tracked her face. You're still dying. Even if you broadcast everything, even if you expose the conspiracy, the poison is irreversible at this stage. The rescue accelerated everything. You have hours, not days. Then I'll make those hours count. Lyra knelt beside him, close enough that he could see the determination burning behind her dimming bioluminescence. I'm going to expose every person involved in this, human and Valderon. I'm going to make sure that when I die, if I die, the people responsible spend the rest of their lives answering for it. She stood, moving back to the communication console. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked, the poison affecting her fine motor control. But years of engineering training meant she could compensate for the deterioration. 2 hours passed in focused work, building the broadcast, compiling evidence, creating a narrative that was clear and irrefutable, and damning to everyone involved. The poison was making it harder to concentrate, her thoughts fragmenting at the edges, but she'd been documenting everything for 5 weeks. The work was already done. She just had to present it. Nathaniel returned with the first load of equipment, his face streaked with dust and what might have been someone else's blood. 3 medical bays secured, 4 more to go. Ran into security in Section 7. They're actively looking for us. Did they see you? Not anymore. He set the equipment down carefully, his gaze tracking her face with concern. You're getting worse. Lyra didn't deny it. The dimming bioluminescence was obvious. The tremor in her hands, the way she had to think carefully before moving to ensure her coordination held. I have time? Enough time. Lyra, I have time, she repeated more firmly. Go. Get the rest of the equipment. I need to finish this. Nathaniel looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he moved close, cupped her face in both hands, and pressed his forehead to hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache. 4 hours. I'll be back. Don't you dare die while I'm gone. He left again. Lyra returned to the broadcast, but her hands were shaking harder now, and the cognitive fog was thick enough that she had to reread sentences multiple times to ensure they made sense. 60 hours to irreversible damage had become 40, maybe less. She worked faster. By the time Nathaniel returned with the final equipment load, Lyra had the broadcast ready. 30 minutes of carefully compiled evidence, video of Torvin entering her quarters, audio of conspiracy discussions, biochemical analysis showing the poison's progression, financial records linking Valderon officials to human government accounts, and her face addressing both species directly, explaining exactly what had been done and why. It's ready, she said as Nathaniel secured the last piece of equipment. Are you sure about this? He stood beside her at the console, his presence solid and steady. Once you broadcast, there's no taking it back. Both governments will move against you immediately. I know. Lyra's finger hovered over the transmission key. But if I don't do this, they win by default. This way, at least the truth survives even if I don't. You're going to survive. Nathaniel's hand covered hers on the console. Evelyn will synthesize the cure. We'll get it to you in time. You're going to serve, and then you're going to watch every single person involved in this answer for what they've done. Lyra looked at their joined hands, radiance blooming where their skin touched. She'd spent 5 weeks preparing for this moment. 5 weeks of careful documentation and quiet investigation. 5 weeks of watching herself deteriorate while gathering the evidence that would expose everyone responsible. Now the moment was here, and she was terrified. Not of dying, she'd made peace with that possibility weeks ago, but of failing, of the broadcast not being enough, of dying and having it all mean nothing. Stand with me? She asked quietly. Always. Lyra pressed the transmission key. The broadcast went out across every Valderon communication frequency and through human networks before anyone could stop it. 30 minutes of irrefutable evidence. Her face, composed despite the visible effects of advanced poisoning, explaining everything. The names, the evidence, the conspiracy's scope, the human officials involved. All of it, public and unavoidable. The response was immediate. Government officials scrambled to deny involvement, to distance themselves from Torvin and his co-conspirators, to claim they'd been victims of manipulation. Some segments of the Valderon military moved to seize control of key installations. Others remained loyal, uncertain who to trust. The empire fractured in real time, broadcast across every screen. What no one could deny was that Lyra had survived. What no one could ignore was that a human had been instrumental in that survival. What no one could escape was the image of them standing together, her hand in his, their commitment visible despite every protocol that forbade it. 30 minutes after the broadcast ended, Dr. Evelyn Cartwright confirmed she had all the equipment and was beginning synthesis. Estimated time, 16 hours for the first viable attempt. Lyra had perhaps 36 hours before irreversible damage. The mathematics were getting tighter. She collapsed 20 minutes later. The poison and the stress and the 5 weeks of deterioration all converging at once. Nathaniel caught her before she hit the floor, his arms supporting her weight as consciousness slipped away. Stay with me, she heard him say from very far away. Lyra, stay with me. The cure is coming. You just have to hold on. But holding on was getting harder. The poison had been designed to degrade slowly, then cascade rapidly once it reached critical thresholds. She'd crossed that threshold hours ago when she'd fought Torvin, when she'd prepared the broadcast, when she'd pushed her body beyond what the poisoned tissue could sustain. Darkness pulled at her with the weight of inevitability. Somewhere in that darkness, she felt Nathaniel's hands on her face, heard his voice calling her back, felt the warmth of his skin against hers, the desperation in his grip that said he wasn't ready to let her go. She tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The poison had progressed too far, the cognitive fog too thick. She managed to squeeze his hand once, a signal that she heard him, that she was still fighting. Then nothing. 16 hours later, Dr. Evelyn Cartwright completed the synthesis. The compound glowed with an unstable radiance that suggested it would degrade within hours if not administered immediately. "It's aggressive," Evelyn said, her face tight with stress as she prepared the injection. "It'll strip the poison and repair cellular damage simultaneously. She'll need days to recover from the cellular reconstruction. And there's a 30% chance her system will reject it entirely." "And if we don't administer it?" Nathaniel asked. He'd been sitting beside Lyra's unconscious form for the entire 16 hours, leaving only when absolutely necessary, monitoring her vitals with the obsessive focus of someone who'd lost too many people and refused to lose another. "She has perhaps 6 hours before the damage becomes irreversible, 12 before her system begins complete shutdown. Then we use it." Nathaniel's voice held no doubt. She'd rather die trying than wait for certainty. The injection site was at the base of her spine, where the poison's roots ran deepest. Evelyn administered the compound with hands that didn't shake, with confidence born from years of research and dangerous faith in protocols that had never been tested on living subjects. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Lyra's bioluminescence began to change. The dark veins of poison that had spread beneath her emerald skin visibly receded, pulled back from her blood vessels like something being expelled by force. Her eyes brightened beneath closed lids. Her breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, deepened into something closer to normal. And then she seized. Her body arched off the bench, every muscle contracting at once, as the cure and poison fought for control of her cellular structure. Nathaniel's hands found her shoulders, holding her steady without restraining her, providing anchor without constraint. "It's the cellular reconstruction," Evelyn said, her eyes locked on the medical readouts streaming across her portable console. "The cure is working, the poison is degrading, but the process is violent. Her immune system is fighting both the poison and the cure, trying to determine which is the bigger threat." The seizure lasted 47 seconds. Then Lyra went completely still, her bioluminescence stabilizing into something closer to normal, her breathing evening out into deep, regular rhythm. "Is she—" Nathaniel couldn't finish the question. "She's alive." Evelyn's voice carried relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "The compound is working, poison degrading, immune system fighting the remaining toxins and winning. She'll be unconscious for at least 12 hours while her body repairs the cellular damage. Possibly longer." Nathaniel's hand found Lyra's, his grip gentle despite the tension still thrumming through his frame. "How long until we know if she'll recover fully?" 24 hours minimum. But the fact that she survived the first administration? Evelyn managed a tired smile. "That's the hardest part. If her system was going to reject the cure, it would have happened immediately. She's fighting, and she's winning." 3 hours after the cure was administered, the assassination attempt arrived. Human supremacists who'd seen Lyra's survival and her alliance with Nathaniel as betrayal of species interests. They breached the secure chamber with military precision, moving through the damaged flagship's quarters with weapons designed to kill both human and Valderon targets. Nathaniel met them at the door. He'd been waiting, calculating, preparing for exactly this scenario since the broadcast went public. The attackers expected to find a damaged ruler and a limping diplomat. They found a Marine who'd spent 16 hours planning defensive positions and wasn't willing to lose the person he'd saved. The fight was brutal. Nathaniel took a glancing shot to his shoulder, the energy weapon burning through jacket and into flesh. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because behind him, Lyra was unconscious and vulnerable, and these people wanted her dead. He made sure they failed. By the time loyal security forces arrived, drawn by the weapons fire, 3 attackers were subdued and the 4th was dead. Nathaniel stood over Lyra's unconscious form, his shoulder bleeding, his damaged leg threatening to buckle, but still tracking every entrance for additional threats. The security commander, one of the few Lyra had identified as uninvolved in the conspiracy, looked at the scene with an expression that mixed respect and horror. "The broadcast is causing riots in 3 sectors. Both governments are demanding her immediate arrest. There's an execution order with her name on it for protocol violations alone. Then they'll have to go through me first, Nathaniel said simply. 14 hours after the cure was administered, Lyra's eyes opened. Nathaniel was there, his hand still holding hers, his shoulder bandaged, but his attention focused entirely on her face. "Hey," he said softly. "Welcome back." Lyra's eyes, that pale blue like winter sky, tracked the room, processing, calculating. When she spoke, her voice was raw but strong. "The broadcast? Went out exactly as you planned. Both governments are in chaos. Conspirators are being rounded up. Torvin is in custody awaiting trial." Nathaniel's thumb traced circles on her palm. "You did it. You exposed them." And the cure? She could feel the difference in her body. The poison's weight was gone. The cognitive fog lifted. The constant pain in her right side reduced to manageable levels. "Working. Evelyn says you'll need days to fully recover from the cellular reconstruction, but the poison is degrading." His grip tightened slightly. "You're going to survive." Lyra processed that. Survival. Something she'd calculated against for 5 weeks, planned around, prepared to sacrifice if necessary to expose the truth. Now she had both. The truth was public, and she was alive to see the consequences. "How long did I have?" she asked, her voice still raw. "If you hadn't descended after me, if I'd stayed calm, avoided physical exertion like I'd planned." Nathaniel's expression tightened. "Evelyn ran the calculations based on your documentation. If you'd remained calm, 8 weeks before irreversible damage. And after the rescue, 72 hours. His hand gripped hers tighter. "When I pulled you from that debris, when we fought Torvin, when you prepared the broadcast, every moment of adrenaline accelerated the poison's progression." She managed a weak smile. "You didn't doom me by saving me, Nathaniel. You freed me from the paralysis of trying to survive alone. I was gathering evidence slowly because I was afraid of triggering the conspiracy, afraid of the adrenaline spike that would kill me faster. You removing that choice, forcing immediate action, it was the only thing that gave us a chance. There's something else you need to know," Nathaniel said, his expression shifting to something more serious. "There's a summons. Both governments have called for tribunal. You're being charged with destabilizing 2 governments, conspiracy, and 37 counts of protocol violation. The trial starts in 3 days." Lyra looked at him, at this human who'd descended into destruction to save her, who'd fought beside her against her own security forces, who'd held her hand through 16 hours of uncertainty while she fought for survival on a cellular level. "They'll try to separate us," she said quietly. "I know. They'll execute you for protocol violations if they can." "I know that too." Lyra's fingers interlaced with his, soft light pulsing where their skin touched. "I won't let them." "We stand together," Nathaniel said. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Before the trial, before the tribunal could assemble, Torvin was transferred to high-security detention. Lyra watched the security feed as they moved him, still bleeding from the cauterized wrist, still defiant despite being bound and surrounded by 8 guards. The holding facility was designed for exactly this, containing high-level threats who knew too much to be released and were too dangerous to be kept in standard cells. She made sure he had access to station broadcasts, made sure he could watch everything she was building. His prison would be lined with screens showing the truth of what cooperation could create. It wouldn't be enough to stop him from trying again. Men like Torvin didn't change their minds when confronted with evidence. But it would make his inevitable escape, and she knew he would escape. Conspirators always had resources, more painful. He'd spend however long he remained imprisoned, watching the world prove him wrong. 3 days to prepare for a trial that would determine if exposing conspiracy was worth the cost of every protocol they'd violated. 3 days to recover enough strength to defend herself and the choices she'd made. 3 days to figure out how to survive what came after survival. Lyra closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength, then opened them with renewed focus. "Then we'd better start planning. Because I didn't survive assassination and poisoning just to lose at tribunal." Nathaniel's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "What do you need?" "Everything." Lyra pushed herself to sitting, ignoring the way her body protested. "Evidence, witnesses, legal precedent, and a strategy for turning their prosecution into our platform. Because Lyra hadn't just exposed the conspiracy, she'd fractured the foundation both governments had built on secrecy and controlled information. The trial would either cement that fracture or seal it over. She intended to shatter it completely. Outside the secure chamber, both empires waited to see what would happen when a poisoned ruler who'd chosen truth over silence stood before tribunal alongside the human who'd helped her survive. The answer would reshape everything. The tribunal chamber existed in the space between empires, anchored to nothing, belonging to neither species. Its architecture reflected that neutrality with brutal honesty, half Valderon curves and luminescent surfaces, half human angular pragmatism and reinforced steel. The chamber floated in orbit precisely equidistant from human and Valderon-controlled space, a physical manifestation of the principle that justice required distance from power. Lyra stood in the center of that chamber and felt the weight of 200 years of diplomatic precedent pressing down on her shoulders. The tribunal judges sat elevated above the floor, 3 Valderon and 3 human, their faces carved from the kind of professional neutrality that came from decades of navigating conflicts where emotion was liability. Behind her, separated by exactly 2 meters as protocol demanded even now, Nathaniel Thorne stood in formal human military dress. His shoulder was bandaged beneath the uniform jacket, the burn from the assassination attempt still healing. His damaged leg held his weight without visible strain, though she knew the effort that required. The intensity in his gaze tracked every person in the chamber with the tactical awareness of someone calculating threat assessments and exit strategies. The charges were read in both languages, the words echoing through the chamber's perfect acoustics. 37 counts of protocol violation, unauthorized physical contact with a head of state, conspiracy to destabilize Valderon government structure, unauthorized broadcast of classified information, treason against established diplomatic frameworks. The prosecutor stood, a Valderon official whose silver eyes held the cold certainty of someone prosecuting a case he'd decided before evidence was presented. The human knowingly and deliberately violated every sacred protocol governing human-Valderon relations. He initiated unauthorized physical contact with ruler Lyra. He accessed secure communication systems. He orchestrated the public exposure of classified government information. He transformed a medical emergency into a political crisis that has destabilized an entire government and threatened the peace we've spent a decade building. The prosecutor's gaze shifted to Lyra. And the ruler, compromised by emotional attachment to her rescuer, has validated every action that should have resulted in immediate execution. She stands before this tribunal not as victim of conspiracy, but as co-conspirator in the destruction of diplomatic order. Silence filled the chamber. Lyra felt it press against her skin, felt the expectation that she would respond with careful diplomatic language, that she would soften the truth with political necessity. She chose differently. He saved my life. 3 words, simple and absolute, delivered with the same authority she'd used to command evacuation during the explosion, to order Torvin's arrest, to broadcast the truth across both empires despite knowing the cost. The prosecutor's expression tightened. He violated every protocol, Lyra interrupted, her voice cutting through his words with precision. Yes, he did. And in doing so, he revealed a conspiracy that would have killed me and started a war between our species within 6 months. She moved forward, ignoring the subtle protest from her recovering body, her gaze tracking each judge in sequence. The conspiracy wasn't isolated. It wasn't a few officials acting independently. It was a coordinated effort between human and Valderon governments to eliminate me and install a ruler both sides could control. A ruler who would sign treaties favorable to human business interests. A ruler who would dismantle the peace framework we've been building in favor of economic partnerships that benefited conspirators on both sides. Lyra pulled up the holographic display, evidence she'd compiled over 5 weeks of careful documentation. Financial records appeared in the air between her and the judges, showing money flowing from human corporate accounts to Valderon officials. Communication logs displayed conversations about timeline adjustments and regime changes. Video footage showed Torvin entering her private quarters, administering poison synthesized from her own research. This conspiracy operated with the knowledge and tacit support of officials in both our governments, she continued. They viewed my death as advantageous, as an opportunity, as a chance to reshape the political landscape in their favor. The prosecutor tried to interrupt. The ruler is clearly, I'm not finished. Lyra's bioluminescence flared with barely contained intensity. Nathaniel Thorne violated protocol because the people who created those protocols had betrayed them so thoroughly that the rules themselves had become weapons. He saved my life because saving it was the right thing to do, regardless of political cost. He stood with me against conspiracy because standing together was the only way to survive. She turned to face the human judges directly. Your government was complicit. Human officials funded the conspiracy, approved the timeline, discussed which Valderon ruler they'd prefer to negotiate with once I was eliminated. The evidence is irrefutable. I have names, I have financial records, I have video of your officials planning my assassination. One of the human judges, a woman whose gray hair and sharp eyes suggested she'd spent decades in diplomatic service, leaned forward. Ruler Lyra, are you prepared to submit to psychological evaluation to verify your objectivity on these matters? The prosecutor suggests you've been compromised by emotional attachment to the human. Lyra's radiance intensified until the entire chamber seemed to glow with her fury. I would not. My judgment isn't compromised. It's clarified. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing the value of choosing something over power, of choosing someone, of choosing truth even when truth is inconvenient. She looked back at Nathaniel, at this human who'd descended into destruction to find her, who'd violated every protocol because saving her mattered more than following rules designed to keep them apart. He violated protocol because I was dying, and he refused to let protocol be the reason I died. I validated his actions because they exposed corruption that infected both our governments. We stand here together because standing together was the only way to fight conspiracy that wanted us divided. The silence that followed was profound. Lyra watched the judges process her words, saw calculations moving behind their professional neutrality. They'd expected her to defend Nathaniel by minimizing his actions. Instead, she'd amplified them, claimed them as necessary, argued that protocol violation was justified response to governmental betrayal. The lead judge, a Valderon official whose dark eyes held the weight of 200 treaty negotiations, spoke carefully. You understand that what you're arguing would set precedent that undermines the entire framework of human Valderon diplomatic relations. If protocol can be violated whenever someone judges it necessary, the structure we've built collapses. The structure was already collapsing, Lyra countered. The conspiracy proved that. Your governments were willing to assassinate a head of state to reshape political dynamics. They were willing to start a war through elimination rather than negotiation. The protocols didn't protect me. They enabled the people trying to kill me. She moved closer to the judge's platform, her hands open, her radiance steady despite the emotional intensity burning through her. I'm not arguing for abandonment of all protocol. I'm arguing that when protocol becomes weapon against truth, when rules designed to protect become tools for conspiracy, then choosing to break those rules isn't violation. It's necessity. Nathaniel spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the roughness that came from years of shouting orders over gunfire. The ruler makes it sound like I had a choice. I didn't. When she fell, when I saw her trapped beneath debris, the only choice I had was whether to help or walk away. Everything else, protocol, consequences, execution, became irrelevant the moment I decided helping mattered more than surviving. He stepped forward, closing the 2-meter distance protocol demanded, standing beside Lyra with the kind of deliberate defiance that said he understood exactly what he was doing. I violated protocol. I accept responsibility. But I don't regret it. I'd do it again. Every single violation, every broken rule, because she was worth saving and the conspiracy needed exposing. And sometimes doing what's right matters more than following what's legal. Their hands found each other, fingers interlacing, soft light blooming where Valderon's skin touched human flesh. The contact was visible to every person in the chamber, recorded by every camera, broadcast across both empires as evidence of protocol violation. Neither of them let go. The tribunal adjourned for 2 days to consider judgment. Lyra and Nathaniel were confined to neutral quarters, neither imprisoned nor free, their fate suspended in the same careful balance as the chamber itself. They spent those 2 days planning for every possible outcome. execution, exile, imprisonment. Lyra worked through legal precedents with the focused intensity of someone who'd been trained to find solutions in impossible situations. Nathaniel handled tactical considerations, mapping escape routes they'd probably never use but needed to have ready. On the third day, the tribunal reconvened. The lead judge spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering words that would reshape diplomatic history. This tribunal finds that the conspiracy alleged by ruler Lyra is substantiated by evidence. Human and Valderon officials are hereby charged with conspiracy to commit assassination, governmental destabilization, and violations of the treaty frameworks they were sworn to uphold. Relief flooded through Lyra, immediate and overwhelming. They'd believed her. The evidence had been enough. However, the judge continued, and the relief crystallized into tension. The protocol violations committed by Nathaniel Thorne and validated by ruler Lyra cannot be dismissed regardless of justification. The framework we've built requires consequences for violation, or the framework itself becomes meaningless. The judge's eyes tracked between them, measuring, calculating. Therefore, this tribunal offers three options. First, Nathaniel Thorne may return to human space under guard and face trial in human courts for treason and violation of diplomatic protocols. Second, he may accept formal exile, becoming citizen of neither species, unable to return to Earth or access human-controlled space, unable to claim Valderon resources or protection. Lyra felt Nathaniel's hand tighten on hers. Both options were exile in different forms. Both removed him from any life he'd known. Both punished him for choosing to save her. The third option, the judge said, and something shifted in her tone, is that you could establish a neutral zone, a place belonging to neither human nor Valderon space, a place where you could build something together, a joint initiative focused on bridging our species rather than deepening the divide between them. Lyra's breath caught. The third option wasn't punishment, it was opportunity. If you undertake this path, the judge continued, you would represent both governments in an unofficial capacity. You would be on the front lines of proving that cooperation between our species is possible. You would operate without the protection of either power structure, and you would face opposition from every faction that benefits from our division. The judge paused, letting the weight of that settle. You would be building something that has never existed, and you would be doing so with every extremist on both sides actively working to destroy what you create. Lyra didn't hesitate. We accept. Nathaniel began, we should discuss. No. Lyra turned to face him fully, her radiance blazing bright enough to cast shadows. We accept. This is what we fought for, what we survived for, the chance to build something better than the system that tried to kill us. She looked back at the judges. We accept the third option. We'll establish your neutral zone. We'll prove cooperation is possible, and we'll make sure that what we build lasts long enough to change how our species see each other. The neutral station took 8 months to construct. Lyra designed every aspect of it. Her engineering background finally applied to something that mattered more than theoretical papers or academic exercises. The architecture was deliberately split, half Valderon elegant curves and bioluminescent materials, half human functional angles and reinforced composites. The division wasn't separation, it was integration. Two different design philosophies meeting at junction points, learning to support each other's weight, creating something that was stronger for being built from difference rather than uniformity. The station's central hub existed at the exact meeting point between design styles. Neither purely Valderon nor purely human, it incorporated elements of both into something new. That's where Lyra and Nathaniel established their quarters, living literally at the intersection of two species, two cultures, two ways of seeing the universe. Lyra established the governance framework with the same precision she'd used to design the station's structure. Democratic council with representatives from both species. Laws that protected both cultural practices while establishing common ground. Trade agreements with independent operators who'd been shut out of official channels by governmental monopolies. She negotiated with Valderon trade guilds and human shipping consortiums, offering them something neither government could provide, truly neutral territory where business could operate without political interference. The guilds calculated risk versus reward and decided betting on the station's future was worth more than obeying present governmental restrictions. Nathaniel handled security. He trained a mixed force of human and Valderon personnel, in tactics that combined both species' strengths. Human adaptability and improvisation merged with Valderan precision and discipline. The security teams learned to think in both tactical frameworks simultaneously, covering each other's vulnerabilities while amplifying each other's capabilities. The first residents arrived within 2 months, a human engineer fleeing extremist violence after her husband was killed for advocating cross-species cooperation. A Valderon family escaping traditionalist persecution because their daughter had fallen in love with a human scientist. Refugees from both sides who'd chosen connection over division and found themselves with nowhere else to go. Lyra welcomed each of them personally, learned their names, understood their stories, made sure they knew the station wasn't just sanctuary, it was home. By month 4, the station's population had grown to 200. Scientists from both species collaborating on research that would have been impossible in segregated environments. Cultural exchanges, creating understanding where suspicion had lived. Children from both species playing together in the commons, learning each other's languages with the natural adaptability of the young. The first crisis arrived in month 2. Both governments quietly restricted supply shipments. Food deliveries were delayed. Medical supplies were rerouted to other facilities. Maintenance parts became mysteriously unavailable. The message was clear. The station existed only at the government's pleasure, and that pleasure could be withdrawn at any moment. Lyra responded with the same strategic thinking she'd used to survive conspiracy. She couldn't fight governmental restrictions directly. The station had no military power, no economic leverage, no political weight beyond what they'd built themselves, so she went around them. She contacted every independent trading operation that had been locked out of official contracts by governmental favoritism. Spent days in negotiations with a freighter captain named Marcus Chen, no relation to any Asian families, purely Anglo-European descent despite the surname, who'd been blacklisted by human authorities for refusing to pay protection money disguised as licensing fees. "What you're offering," Marcus said during their third negotiation session, his weathered face skeptical on the view screen, "sounds like it'll get me shot by both governments." "What I'm offering," Lyra corrected, "is exclusive access to neutral territory, future contracts when the station grows to 2,000 residents, and the chance to build relationships with both species without governmental interference choking your profit margins." She watched him calculate. Present governmental pressure versus future economic opportunity. The same mathematics the trade guilds had already completed. "Your human partner," Marcus said, nodding toward Nathaniel, who stood slightly behind Lyra in the frame. "He understands the logistics?" "Marine Corps," Nathaniel answered. "Ran supply operations in 3 combat zones. I know how to move cargo through unmonitored space when official channels are compromised." Marcus's expression shifted to something like respect. "Then we have a deal. First shipment arrives in 72 hours. After that, weekly runs until your governments decide shooting at independent traders is worth the diplomatic incident." The independent traders calculated the same mathematics the trade guilds had. Present governmental pressure versus future economic opportunity. Many chose future. Nathaniel ran the supply operations Lyra designed. His marine training in logistics and improvisation turned theoretical supply chains into actual deliveries. He found routes through unmonitored space, established relationships with freighter captains who valued profit over politics, built a network that functioned outside governmental control. The station survived, barely, but survival was enough to prove the model worked. Resources stabilized, food arrived, medical supplies were stocked. The residents who'd been quietly terrified that the station would fail began to believe it might actually succeed. Month 3 brought the extremist attack. Torvin had escaped from custody 3 weeks earlier, broken out by co-conspirators who'd scattered when the conspiracy collapsed, but regrouped around shared hatred of what the station represented. He'd united human supremacists and Valderon traditionalists around single purpose: destroy the neutral station before it proved their worldview wrong. The attack came simultaneously from 4 vectors: docking bay breach, life support sabotage, command center assault, residential sector terrorism. 23 attackers total, moving with military precision, armed with weapons designed to kill both species equally. Lyra was in the command center when the alarm sounded. She'd been reviewing expansion proposals, planning for the day when 200 residents became 2,000. The tactical display lit up with breach points, and her mind shifted immediately from architect to defender. She activated station-wide communication. All residents to secure locations. Security teams to breach points Alpha through Delta. This is not a drill. Her hands moved across the command interface, sealing vulnerable sections, rerouting life support to create positive pressure barriers that would slow attackers, activating internal surveillance so she could track enemy movements in real time. Nathaniel was in the residential sector when the attack hit. He'd been conducting security training with the mixed force, running drills that most residents found tedious but necessary. The drills became necessity. Stations under attack, he transmitted to his security teams. 4 breach points, unknown number of hostiles, rules of engagement, disable if possible, kill if necessary. These are the same people who tried to assassinate Lyra. They're not here to talk. The command center breach came first. 5 attackers moving through the damaged docking bay with tactical precision. Lyra watched them on surveillance, calculated their approach vector, and made a decision. She armed herself with the frequency weapon she'd used on Torvin, checked the charge, and moved to intercept. The first attacker came through the command center entrance, expecting to find administrative personnel. He found Lyra instead, her weapon discharging with crystalline precision, the frequency pulse catching him in the center mass and dropping him before he could fire. The second and third attackers adjusted, spreading out to create crossfire angles. Lyra's engineering mind calculated trajectories and cover points. She moved behind a structural support column, used the command center's architecture against them, forced them to expose themselves to get firing angles. She dropped the second attacker with a shot to his weapon arm. The third managed to fire, the energy blast scorching the air centimeters from her head. She returned fire, caught him in the leg, and he went down hard. The fourth and fifth attackers recognized they were outmatched. They tried to retreat. Lyra's security teams were already moving in behind them, weapons raised, blocking the exit. "Stand down," Lyra commanded, her voice carrying absolute authority despite the adrenaline surging through her system. "You're surrounded. Your only choice is surrender or death." They chose surrender. In the residential sector, Nathaniel's marine training activated fully, his body remembering patterns drilled through repetition until they became instinct. He fought alongside 4 Valderon security personnel against 7 attackers trying to reach the civilian shelters. The Valderon troops moved with precision and discipline, their tactics focused on creating defensive positions and holding ground. Nathaniel brought something different, the kind of adaptability that came from fighting in environments where doctrine mattered less than survival. He moved through their defensive formation, adapting to each moment, using human unpredictability against attackers who trained to fight opponents following Valderon tactical doctrine. When the Valderon troops established crossfire, Nathaniel flanked. When they held position, he advanced. When they created killing zones, he drove attackers into them. One of the Valderon security officers, a female named Saris, whose silver eyes tracked combat with professional assessment, found herself fighting back-to-back with the human. An attacker came at her from her blind side, weapon charging. Nathaniel was there before the shot fired, his elbow connecting with the attacker's temple, his hand disarming the weapon in a move that was more street fighting than military training. "Appreciate the assist," Saris managed, her weapon tracking for additional threats. "Humans fight dirty," Nathaniel said, his damaged leg trembling from exertion, but still holding his weight. "It's our specialty." The residential sector was secured within 12 minutes. 7 attackers subdued, 0 civilian casualties, 3 security personnel injured but stable. The life support sabotage attempt failed when the station's automated systems detected the intrusion and isolated the affected section. The docking bay assault collapsed when attackers realized they were trapped between security teams and vacuum. 23 attackers captured, 5 security personnel injured, 0 fatalities on either side. Torvin was found in the command center assault team, his remaining hand bound, his silver eyes tracking Lyra with an expression mixing hatred and something that might have been regret. "You should have died," he said as security forces restrained him. 5 weeks ago, quietly, peacefully. Instead, you've built this." He gestured at the command center, at the station beyond. "This abomination, this mixing of species that were never meant to integrate." Lyra stood over him, her weapon still charged, her radiance steady despite the combat adrenaline. "I could kill you right now. claimed self-defense. No one would question it. She watched him calculate whether she would, saw the moment he recognized she might. But I'm not going to. Lyra lowered her weapon, because killing you would make me like you. And I'd rather you spend the rest of your life in prison, watching this abomination succeed. Watching everything you tried to prevent become reality. She gestured to security. Take him to holding, maximum security, and make sure he has access to station broadcasts. I want him to see everything we build. In the aftermath, Lyra and Nathaniel stood in the observation deck, looking out at the space between empires. The station hummed with life around them, residents emerging from shelters, security teams conducting damage assessment, medical personnel treating the injured. They'll keep coming, Nathaniel said quietly. Extremists who see what we're building as threat to their worldview. I know. Lyra's hand found his, their fingers interlacing automatically. But we'll keep defending, keep building, keep proving that cooperation is possible. You could have killed Torvin. He deserved it after what he did to you. Yes, he did. Lyra's radiance pulsed gently. But executing him would have made his point for him, that we're just another power structure willing to eliminate opposition. Letting him live, forcing him to watch us succeed, proves we're building something different. Month 5 brought the biological breakthrough that changed everything. Dr. Evelyn Cartwright's research team, composed of 3 human scientists and 4 Valderone geneticists, announced they'd isolated the mechanisms allowing biological compatibility between species. The hybrid cure formula Lyra and Evelyn had created to save Lyra's life had forced them to understand both species' biology at unprecedented depth. Building on that foundation, they discovered something revolutionary. The differences between human and Valderone genetics are less fundamental than the similarities, Evelyn announced during the presentation to the station's council. With the right biochemical mediators, with careful genetic stabilization protocols, hybrid children are theoretically possible. The implications were staggering. The station stopped being symbolic and became biologically real. The union between species became something that could literally create new life. The backlash was immediate and predictable. Human extremists called it genetic pollution. Valderone traditionalists declared it corruption of purity. Protests erupted on the station itself, some human residents demanding the research be stopped, some Valderone families expressing fear for their children's future. The station fractured internally for the first time since its founding. Lyra called a general assembly. Every resident gathered in the central commons, the space she'd designed to accommodate both species comfortably. She stood on the raised platform with Nathaniel beside her, their presence together now familiar enough that it no longer shocked. I'm not going to tell you the biological research is risk-free, she began, her voice carrying through the commons without amplification. I'm not going to claim there aren't valid concerns about long-term genetic implications. And I'm absolutely not going to force anyone to accept something they find fundamentally wrong. She paused, letting that settle. But I'm also not going to stop the research. Because what Dr. Cartwright's team has discovered represents hope. Hope that our species can integrate at the most fundamental level. Hope that the children born here could be truly native to both cultures. Hope that what we're building isn't temporary accommodation, but permanent synthesis. A human woman in the crowd stood, her expression troubled. What if we don't want synthesis? What if we came here because we support cooperation but not integration? Then you're welcome to leave, Lyra said simply, with honor, with gratitude for the time you spent helping build this place, but without judgment. This station exists for people who believe cooperation between our species is possible. If you've decided your limits stop short of biological integration, that's a valid choice. But it's not a choice you get to make for everyone else. A Valderone male rose, his bioluminescence flickering with uncertainty. And if we stay, if we support this research, what happens when our own governments declare us traitors for enabling genetic corruption? Then we defend each other, Nathaniel answered. The same way we defended against Torvin's attack. The same way we've defended against every attempt to destroy what we're building. Together. The vote was called. 30% chose to leave. 70% chose to stay. Lyra watched the 30% depart with mixed emotions. Sadness at losing people who'd helped build the station. relief that the remaining 70% were absolutely committed to what came next. Understanding that some divisions couldn't be bridged, and forcing bridge building only created resentment. The 70% who remained were stronger for having chosen consciously rather than defaulted passively. The departures, while painful, clarified the station's purpose. This wasn't a place for people who wanted cooperation on their terms. It was a place for people willing to explore what cooperation could become. Month 8 brought communication from the Valderon government. They wanted Lyra back. The formal request was delivered by diplomatic courier, encrypted through enough layers that reading it required Lyra's personal biometric authentication. The message was simple and devastating. Full reinstatement as ruler, full authority. Complete pardon for all protocol violations. The Valderon government had calculated that opposition to the station had weakened their political position with both their own people and human counterparts. Supporting the station would strengthen them. They were offering Lyra everything she'd had before the conspiracy, everything she'd sacrificed to expose the truth. Nathaniel found her in their quarters, staring at the diplomatic request displayed on her personal console. What did they offer? The throne. Lyra's voice was steady, but her radiance flickered with emotional turbulence. Everything I gave up. They want me to return, use my authority to legitimize the station, strengthen their political position by supporting what they initially opposed. Will you go? Lyra was quiet for a long moment, looking at the offer, at everything it represented: power, authority, the ability to reshape Valderon government from the inside rather than building alternatives from the outside. No, the word was simple and absolute. She turned to face Nathaniel, her gaze clear and certain. I don't want to rule an empire built on the foundation of division. I want to build something new here. Something that doesn't rely on one species having authority over another. Something that proves cooperation is possible not because governments mandate it, but because people choose it. She moved to the window, looking out at the station she'd designed, at the residents moving through corridors that integrated two architectural philosophies, at the children playing together in common spaces, at the security teams patrolling in mixed pairs. This is what I choose, she said quietly, not because it's easier, but because it matters more. Nathaniel's hand found her shoulder. They won't like that answer. I know. Lyra's radiance steadied, burning bright and clear, but I've spent my entire life doing what was expected rather than what I wanted. I exposed conspiracy because it was right, not because it was safe. I built this station because it mattered, not because it was easy. She turned back to him. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. And I'm choosing to believe we can build something that lasts. She sent her refusal the same day. The Valderon government's response was predictably hostile, but by that point, the station had proven too valuable to both species' economic interests to be easily eliminated. The neutral zone had become essential infrastructure, whether governments wanted to admit it or not. Year 1 ended with the station population at 847, 412 human, 435 Valderon, 23 mixed species marriages, research collaborations numbering in the hundreds, trade agreements facilitating billions in commerce, and one pregnancy. Not Lyra and Nathaniel, the biological compatibility protocols hadn't been tested thoroughly enough for them to risk attempting conception, but a human man and Valderon woman who'd met on the station, who'd fallen in love during the crisis response to Torvin's attack, who'd volunteered for the experimental treatment Dr. Cartwright's team had developed. The pregnancy succeeded, against all medical predictions, against all cultural expectations. The child was born in the station's medical facility with Lyra and Nathaniel present as witnesses. The infant had human facial structure with Valderon luminescent skin that glowed softly in the dim lighting. Her cry was pitched between both species' vocal ranges, a sound that was neither fully human nor fully Valderon. She was something new, something that had never existed before. Lyra held the child with careful reverence, looking down at this tiny person who represented everything they'd fought for. The biological proof that cooperation wasn't just symbolic, that what they were building could literally create new life. What will you name her? Lyra asked the parents. Arya, the Valderon mother said, her radiance pulsing with exhausted joy. It means hope in both our languages. In the maximum security facility, Torvin watched the birth announcement on the view screen mounted to his cell wall. The infant's face filled the display, Human features with Valderon-luminescent skin, eyes that held characteristics of both species. He'd spent 8 months in this cell watching Lyra build everything he'd tried to prevent. 8 months watching the station grow from impossible idea to thriving reality. 8 months of evidence accumulating that he'd been wrong about fundamental assumptions regarding species compatibility. 8 months wasn't enough to change beliefs held for 45 years, but it was enough to recognize he'd lost. "You were right," he said to the empty cell, knowing Lyra wouldn't hear him, knowing it didn't matter. Not about everything, but about this, about her. He gestured at the infant on screen. About the possibility I couldn't see because I was too committed to what I'd always believed. The admission cost him nothing, changed nothing. He would die in this cell holding the same convictions that had brought him here. Some people were too old, too set, too invested in their worldview to transform even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. But he could acknowledge the loss, could recognize that Lyra had won not through force or manipulation, but through proving cooperation worked better than division. He'd tried to kill her to prevent this future. She'd let him live to watch it become reality. In the calculus of victory and defeat, there was poetry in that reversal he could almost appreciate. Almost. Year 2 arrived with celebration. The station's population had grown to over 1,000. The neutral zone had expanded to include 3 additional habitats. Trade flowing through the station had become essential to both empires' economies. Cultural exchanges had created understanding that was reshaping how both species saw each other. Violent incidents had dropped from 47 in the first 6 months to 3 in the last year. The extremists were running out of people willing to commit violence for worldviews that looked increasingly archaic as the station succeeded. Lyra and Nathaniel stood at the observation platform, watching ships from both species move through the space that had once seemed impossibly distant. The morning briefing had outlined the day's challenges: a trade negotiation threatening to collapse over tariff interpretations, a cultural misunderstanding about timekeeping systems that needed mediation, 2 new resident applications fleeing violence on both sides. Remarkably unremarkable. The work of building continued, persistent and daily, moment by moment. "You built this," Nathaniel said quietly, his hand finding hers. "We built this," Lyra corrected. "I had the vision. You helped me defend it." Dr. Cartwright made integration biologically possible. Saris and her security teams kept us safe. The residents chose to believe cooperation mattered more than division. She turned to face him. "It wasn't one person. It was all of us choosing together." "You chose first," Nathaniel countered, "when you decided to expose the conspiracy instead of dying quietly. When you broadcast the truth knowing it might get you killed. When you accepted Tribunal's third option instead of taking your throne back." Lyra looked at their joined hands, soft light blooming where their skin connected. 2 years ago, that contact had been absolutely forbidden. Protocol violation worth execution. Now it was simply them. 2 people who'd chosen each other, chosen truth, chosen to build something better than the systems that had tried to keep them apart. Below them in the commons, children from both species played together. Human and Valderon security personnel patrolled in mixed pairs. Scientists collaborated in laboratories that combined both species' technologies. Traders negotiated in multiple languages, facilitated by translation systems that were becoming less necessary as both species learned each other's speech. A human medical technician walked past in conversation with a Valderon biologist, their discussion animated and technical. A mixed-species couple sat at the Commons Cafe, their infant daughter, the second hybrid child, sleeping peacefully in a carrier designed to accommodate both species' physiology. That evening, in the quiet of their quarters where Valderon luminescence met human lighting in perfect balance, Lyra sat before the mirror. Her fingers moved to her hair, to the crown elements that had been growing there since her coronation 15 years ago. The biological markers were woven through dark strands, symbols of authority she'd worn so long they'd become part of her identity. She'd kept them even after refusing the throne, unwilling to let go of what they represented. Tonight, for the first time, she wanted them gone. "Let me help." Nathaniel's hands found hers in the mirror's reflection, gentle despite the calluses that marked years of handling weapons. "They don't come out easily," Lyra warned. "The removal process hurts." "I know." His fingers worked carefully through her hair, finding the junction points where biology met authority. But you don't have to carry them anymore. You're not that ruler, you're something better. The first crown element came free with a sharp spike of pain. Lyra's radiance flared in response, and Nathaniel's thumb traced the sensitive spot on her scalp with such tenderness that the pain transformed into something else entirely. When you fell, he said quietly, working on the second element, when I descended into that debris field after you, I wasn't thinking about saving a ruler. I was thinking about saving you. The person who'd asked me to dance despite protocol. The person whose pain I recognized because I carried my own. The second element released. Then the third. I've spent my entire life defined by what I was supposed to be, Lyra said, watching their reflection, his scarred human hands working through her alien hair, removing symbols of power with the same precision he'd used to remove debris from her body. Ruler, engineer, symbol of my species. Even now, people see me as the face of integration rather than just me. I see you. Nathaniel removed the fourth element, his gaze meeting hers in the mirror. I've always seen you, not the ruler, not the symbol, just Lyra, the woman who designed poison and cure with equal brilliance, who chose truth over survival, who built an empire not through conquest, but through proving cooperation was possible. The last crown element came free, and Lyra felt the weight of 15 years lift from her shoulders. She turned to face him directly, her dark hair falling loose around her face, her radiance pulsing with emotion she no longer tried to hide. I love you, she said simply. Not because you saved me, not because you stood with me against conspiracy, but because when I tested you by asking you to dance, you chose me over protocol, and you've been choosing me every day since. Nathaniel cupped her face in both hands, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw where light bloomed brightest. I've got you. From that first moment in the debris until the last moment either of us takes breath, I've got you, and I'm never letting go. When he kissed her, it carried all the intensity of everything they'd survived together. The conspiracy, the poison, the trial, the attacks, every moment of choosing each other when surrender would have been easier. Outside their quarters, the station hummed with life they'd built together. Inside, they existed in the space between species, between empires, between what they'd been told they should be and what they'd chosen to become. The stars continued their rotation beyond the observation window. The ships continued their movement through space that was no longer divided between empires, but integrated into something new. The station hummed with the presence of beings from two species learning to exist not as separate peoples temporarily coexisting, but as one community permanently evolving. In their quarters at the junction point between Valderan and human architecture, where neither design philosophy dominated and both contributed equally, Lyra and Nathaniel existed in the space they'd created together, a place where protocol had finally learned to bend, where love had proven stronger than the rules designed to prevent it, where the unthinkable had become simply the way things were. What had started with one human saying those three simple words to an alien ruler, trapped beneath debris, had become foundation upon which futures were being built. Not immediately, not without struggle, but with the persistence of people who had decided cooperation mattered more than convenience. The station they'd built would face more challenges, more attacks, more opposition from people who feared what integration represented. But it would survive, because it was built on foundations stronger than governmental decree or political calculation. It was built on the principle that cooperation between different peoples wasn't just possible, it was inevitable once enough people chose to believe in it. And Lyra and Nathaniel had chosen, together, from the moment she'd fallen and he'd descended after her, from the first touch during that forbidden dance, from every decision after to stand together rather than accept separation. They'd chosen each other over empires. And in choosing, they'd built something that would outlast both.